It's amazing, when you dig into how we actually know, like, for sure if one thing actually causes another. And I've been looking over the sources that you sent this week, and this whole concept of a randomized controlled trial, an RCT, that just seems to be front and center.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, when researchers want to get down to it and really see if A leads to B, the RCT is often kind of the go-to.
Right, the gold standard, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly.
So today, let's just dive right in.
Let's do it.
To these RCTs. What are they? How do they work? Where do they maybe fall short? And to really bring this home, one of the sources you shared, this Bergenholtz 2025B, it talks about a really fascinating experiment all about incentives. And they did it right there in a lab setting. So I'm hoping, as we unpack how RCTs work, that we can use that experiment as a really great example.
Sounds great.
Cool. So let's start with the basics. I mean, why even bother with this whole complicated RCT setup? If we're just trying to figure out if one thing impacts another, what's the core problem these trials are designed to solve?
Well, at the most basic level, an RCT is all about establishing causality. Can we definitively say that doing X causes Y to happen? That's the holy grail. And the thing that makes this really tricky is the whole concept of the counterfactual.
Counterfactual, huh?
Yeah.
Sounds kind of like a science fiction term.
Well, maybe a little bit. But really, it's just asking what would have happened if we hadn't done the thing, right?
Right.
So if you give someone a new drug to treat allergies, the counterfactual is trying to figure out how bad their allergies would have been if they hadn't taken the drug. And this is where the control group in an RCT comes in. It helps us get a glimpse of that counterfactual world.
So if I'm getting this right, like in the aspirin example that Bergenholtz mentions in 2025A, one group gets the actual aspirin, right? And the other group, they get a placebo. So they get like a sugar pill that looks like aspirin, but it's not actually doing anything.
Right, exactly.
And that placebo group, they're kind of our window into what would have happened with those people's headaches if they hadn't taken any real medicine, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's the same idea in that other example about students using AI chatbots and then, how well they do on exams.
Right. So that comparison is key. And this makes me wonder, why can't we just look at people who chose to do something on their own and then compare them to people who didn't? Why not just compare those two groups? What makes the whole RCT setup so important?
Well, the problem there is that if you're just looking at people who chose to do something, there might be other reasons why they made that choice. Right? So going back to the chatbots, maybe the students who decided to use a chatbot were already more motivated to study.
Right. They're the kind of students who are going to do well anyway.
Exactly. Yeah. Or maybe they were struggling more with the material, and so they thought, hey, maybe this chatbot can give me an edge.
Right. So it's not the chatbot itself that's making the difference. It's just that those students are already different.
Yeah, that's what we call selection bias. When people self-select into a group, you're not starting with a level playing field. There are already all these other factors, these confounding variables that could be affecting the outcome, and you just can't tease them apart.
Right. So it's not a fair comparison anymore. It's like you're trying to figure out if, I don't know, eating apples makes you taller, but the people who choose to eat apples are already taller to begin with.
Right, exactly. You can't really know if it's the apples or just who was already in each group.
Gotcha. So that makes a lot of sense. So how does an RCT actually solve this? How does it level the playing field? That's where randomization comes in, right?
Exactly. Randomization is really the heart and soul of an RCT. It's how you take all these different messy real-world differences and just shuffle them up.
So you're not letting people choose which group they're in or letting the researchers pick and choose. You're just saying, okay, you're going in this group, you're going in this group, flip a coin, whatever.
Exactly. Just pure chance. And that way, the treatment group and the control group are going to be, on average, really similar in all sorts of ways before the treatment even starts.
Yeah.
And that's the key. We want the only consistent difference between the two groups to be the thing we're studying, the treatment itself.
So to stick with the chatbot example, that would mean that the students in both groups, they'd be tackling the same material. They'd be in the same environment, right? Same kind of testing conditions.
Exactly. As much as possible, you want to keep everything the same.
Okay. So same, except for whether or not they're using the chatbot. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess that lab experiment really illustrates this perfectly. Everyone's doing the same tasks in the same room at the same time. The only difference is that access to ChatGPT-4 or not, It's like a really controlled way to see if that one specific thing actually makes a difference.
Exactly. And what's amazing is that randomization actually works really well. Bergenholtz uses this great analogy of flipping a coin, which is perfect. If you only flip a coin a few times, you might get like 3 heads in a row. It feels unbalanced, right?
Right, it doesn't feel very random.
Exactly. But if you flip it hundreds or thousands of times, it's going to even out. You're going to get close to 50 heads and tails.
Right, the more you do it, the more random it gets.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's the same principle with RCTs.
Right.
With a big enough group of people, when you randomly assign them, it's going to distribute all those other factors, those things that might affect the outcome. So things like gender, age, their abilities coming into it, maybe even personality traits. All those things will be pretty evenly spread out between the two groups.
So I guess even if any two individuals from the treatment and control group might still be different, right? Because they're individuals.
Of course.
But when you zoom out and look at the big picture, the groups as a whole become statistically very similar.
Exactly. And there's this table that Bergenholtz refers to, although we can't see it. But it shows how, with a decent sample size, the characteristics of those two randomized groups are going to be pretty darn close to identical. And that's how you really start to zero in on cause and effect.
Got it. And this all ties back to what Izager was talking about in that 2023 piece you sent, right? About guarding against selection bias and all those confounding variables. It's all about having that clear line from treatment to outcome.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we call high internal validity.
Internal validity, okay.
It basically means we can be really confident that it was the treatment itself and not something else that caused the difference we see in that specific study.
So high internal validity means we can trust what the study is telling us.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, cool. So let's assume we've got these two evenly matched groups thanks to randomization. What happens next? Like, how do you actually administer the treatment, and how do you then figure out if it worked?
So once you've got your groups, you give the treatment, the thing you're studying, to the treatment group. The control group either gets nothing or they might get a placebo. But the really important thing is that you keep everything else the same between the two groups. So same environment, same instructions, same procedures. The only planned difference is that treatment itself.
Okay, so same, except for the treatment. That makes sense. And in that incentive experiment, that meant that one group got the higher incentive, the other got the lower one, but they were doing those same tasks in the lab at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And then after the treatment period is over, you measure the outcome. So in the chatbot example, that would be looking at how well each group did on the exam. And in the incentive experiment, it was about how many tasks each group successfully completed.
Right. So you're comparing the results of each group after the treatment.
Right. And you do some fancy statistical analysis to see if there's a difference between the two groups that's big enough to be meaningful. And if there is, and if our randomization worked well, then we could be pretty confident that the treatment actually had an impact. And that's what we mean by statistically significant.
So it's not just a random fluke, right? Like the difference is big enough that it probably wasn't just due to chance.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's internal validity. Makes sense. We set up the study carefully.
Yeah.
We randomize. We compare the results. But then there's this whole other question, right? Like, can we take those findings, those results, and apply them to other situations in the real world? That's where external validity comes in, right?
Exactly. Internal validity is all about how confident we are that the treatment caused the outcome in that specific study. External validity is about whether those findings would apply to other people, other settings, or even at a different point in time.
So a study could have really good internal validity. Like, we're super sure that the treatment caused the effect in the lab. But then it could have really bad external validity if those results just don't hold up in the real world.
Right, exactly. And it's so important to remember that good internal validity is essential before you even start thinking about external validity. Because if you're not even sure that the treatment worked in the first place, then who cares if it would apply to other situations, right?
Right. It's a moot point if your study is flawed to begin with.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive into these factors that make a study more or less externally valid. Now, Bergenholtz 2025A, it draws on this work by Bell and others from 2022, and they outline 4 main things to consider. So the first one is interaction of selection and treatment. What does that mean?
So this one's all about whether the results you saw in your specific group of participants, whether those results would apply to other types of people, right? So let's think about that incentive experiment in the COBE lab. They used mostly students, aged 19 to 25. Would we see the same effects with, say, high school students? Or how about older professionals working in totally different industries? The point is, who you study really matters. If your group is too narrow, then your findings might not be very useful for anyone else.
Right. I can see that. What gets a college student going might not be the same thing that motivates someone with a mortgage and kids to feed. So different strokes for different folks. All right, what's the next one?
So the next factor is interaction of setting and treatment.
Okay.
And this is looking at whether the results would be similar if the study was done in a different place or with different tasks. So in that incentive experiment, they use like math problems and anagrams, right, in a lab. Would we see the same effects if we were looking at, say, a busy office with people working on complex projects and projects that take weeks or months?
Right, so the setting really matters. Doing puzzles in a quiet lab, that's not really the same as dealing with a tight deadline and a demanding boss.
Yeah, exactly. Context is everything.
Okay, so next up is interaction of history and treatments.
Right.
And this one seems to be about like when the study was actually done, right? Like the time period.
Yeah, exactly. Societies change, technology changes, even our culture changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
So would the results from a study done 5 years ago still hold true today? And Bergenholtz actually mentions that some of their data was collected during the whole COVID-19 pandemic, which obviously was a huge upheaval. And although they didn't see any major differences in performance before and during the pandemic, it's just a good reminder that research is always a snapshot in time.
Right, so what might have been true in 2021 might not be true in 2026, or who knows, even 2024. And that last one on the list, the Hawthorne effect, that's the one where people change their behavior just because they know they're being watched, right?
Exactly. Just being part of a study can make people act differently, sometimes without them even realizing it. They might try harder or be more helpful or even try to guess what the researchers want and act accordingly.
So they're not really being themselves?
Not entirely, no. And that makes it really tough to figure out if it's the treatment that's causing the change or if it's just the fact that they're in a study.
Right, like they're putting on a show for the scientists.
Exactly.
Okay, so basically, when we're trying to figure out how much we can trust that a study's findings will apply to the real world, we have to think about all these things. The people, the place, the time, even the fact that it was a study, it all matters.
Exactly. And it's not a simple yes or no answer, right? It's all about thinking critically and trying to understand how those specific details might have affected the results. And that's a great segue into the idea of ecological validity.
Okay, ecological validity. How does that relate to all this?
So external validity, as we talked about, it's about generalizing to different people, places, and times. Ecological validity zooms in on how much the study actually reflects real life.
Mm-hmm.
How natural is it? A lot of lab experiments, by their very nature, they're kind of artificial. It's a controlled environment, which is great for internal validity. But it might not tell us much about how things actually work in the messy real world.
Right, I'm getting that. So that incentive experiment, with its very specific tasks in that controlled lab setting, it might have had great internal validity. You know, they controlled everything they could.
Right.
But it might not have been very ecologically valid, because those aren't the kind of tasks most people do in their everyday lives.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where field experiments come in.
Okay, field experiments, tell me about those.
So these are studies that are done out in the real world, like in an actual company or organization.
So you're not in a lab anymore, you're in a natural setting.
Exactly. And that gives them high ecological validity. But because you can't control as much in the real world, it can be harder to isolate the effect of the treatment.
Right.
So you might end up with lower internal validity.
Right, it's like a trade-off. You get more realism, but less certainty about what's causing what. And this is what Bergenholtz 2025b talks about with that incentive example, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's one thing to study incentives in a lab with made-up tasks, but it's a whole other thing to look at how real raises affect people's work in their actual jobs. The lab gives you more control, but the real world is where the rubber meets the road.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this other type of study, quasi-experiments, that Bergenholtz mentions as being sort of a middle ground.
Quasi-experiments, right. Now, if I remember correctly, those are the ones where you don't have full randomization, right?
So exactly. So they kind of look like RCTs, but they don't quite meet all the requirements because people aren't being randomly assigned to the groups.
Right. So you can't be assured that the groups are truly comparable.
Exactly. And that makes it harder to rule out those confounding variables and really nail down that cause and effect relationship. But for now, let's maybe shift gears a little and talk about some of the practical challenges of doing RCTs, especially in a business context. Because it sounds like taking this really rigorous approach and trying to apply it to the messy world of business, well, that could be tricky.
Totally agree. What kind of hurdles are we talking about here?
So one common problem is what we call contamination. It's basically when the treatment and control groups start to bleed into each other. You know, in a workplace, people talk. Right. So if one group is testing out a new software, they might end up sharing tips and tricks with their colleagues in the control group, even though they're not supposed to.
Right, so the lines between the groups start to blur.
Exactly. And that makes it hard to know if the treatment is really having an effect or if it's just spreading through the whole workplace.
Makes sense. So what else makes it hard to do RCTs in business?
Well, businesses are just really complex environments. There's always stuff going on, right? The economy, the company's own internal culture, changes in the market, all of that can affect the outcome of a study. It can be really hard to isolate the impact of your treatment when there are all these other things going on at the same time.
Right, so lots of moving parts. And I can imagine that some things, like the overall company culture, you just can't manipulate that in a study, right? You can't just flip a switch and change something as fundamental as that.
Exactly. Some things just aren't controllable in that way. And then, of course, there's also the practical reality that implementing an RCT can be disruptive to a business, right? It might mean changing people's workflows or asking them to do things differently. And companies might be hesitant to do that, especially if they're not sure what the benefit will be or if they're worried about negative consequences.
Right, it's a risk. So even though RCTs are powerful, they're not always the perfect fit for every business question. Okay, so let's bring it back to that concrete example we talked about earlier, that incentive experiment from the Kobe lab. Bergenholtz 2025B lays it all out. How did they design this experiment? They were trying to answer this question of whether higher incentives actually lead to better or worse performance on tasks.
Right, so they created a controlled lab environment and gave everyone the same tasks, which were like solving math problems and unscrambling anagrams. And the only thing they changed was how much money people got for each task they completed correctly. One group got a higher incentive, 5 Danish kroner, and the other group got a lower incentive, 1 Danish krone.
And I remember that they specifically made sure that people didn't know what incentive level they were going to get until right before they started working on the tasks.
Exactly. They didn't want people choosing their group based on how much they thought they would earn.
Right, that would defeat the whole purpose of random assignment.
Yeah, totally. And because of some logistical constraints, they use what we call session-level randomization. So everyone who participated in a given session got the same incentive level. But because people didn't know beforehand what the incentive would be for that session, they couldn't choose their group. And all the sessions were held at the same time of day to keep things as consistent as possible.
Makes sense. And after the experiment, they ran some stats to see if the two incentive groups were actually comparable in terms of like their demographics, just to make sure that the randomization worked.
Exactly. That's a standard procedure to verify that the groups are actually similar. And it's important to remember that experiments like this, they're looking at average effects. So some people might respond really well to incentives, others might not. But the analysis is focused on the overall difference between the two groups.
Okay, so the individual results might vary, but the group difference is what matters.
Right. And they also mentioned a potential limitation, which was that some participants might have heard about the experiment beforehand. And even just knowing that there were different incentives being offered could have subtly influenced their behavior.
So that could have skewed the results a little bit. Okay, so that's how they designed the experiment, to try and isolate the effect of incentives on task performance. But now let's think about those 4 criteria for external validity. How well did those findings actually translate to the real world? And let's start with the participants themselves. Bergenholtz 2025B talks about this a bit.
Yeah, so the participants were mostly university students, 19 to 25 years old, and from that specific Kobe lab. So the question is, would we see the same effects with other types of people? Would high school students react the same way? What about people who are unemployed or folks working in very different industries? It's possible that those findings might apply pretty well to other young adults who are in a similar financial situation, but it's harder to say if they would generalize to people with different backgrounds and different motivations.
Right. What motivates a student might be very different from what motivates a CEO. What about the tasks themselves, like those math problems and anagrams? Do you think the results would hold up with other kinds of tasks?
That's a great question. They acknowledged that using just those specific tasks definitely limits how much we can generalize the findings. Would the same incentive effects hold up with longer, more complex tasks, or with tasks that require people to collaborate? It's possible that the findings might be most relevant for other fairly simple cognitive tasks, but we can't be sure. And they also pointed out that they used paper and pencil for the tasks, so it's possible the results might be different if people were working on computers.
Right. The tools we use can definitely affect how we perform. Okay, so the nature of the task matters. What about the historical context? That was a third factor, right?
Right. So, as we mentioned earlier, some of the data was collected during the pandemic. And even though they didn't find any big differences compared to the pre-pandemic data, it's always possible that the specific circumstances of that time period had some influence on the results. And this is just a general limitation of a lot of research, right? The findings are always tied to a particular point in history.
So what's true today might not be true tomorrow. And finally, what about the Hawthorne effect? Do you think knowing they were in an experiment might have influenced how those participants behaved, even if the incentives were pretty low?
Yeah, that's a really important consideration. It's possible that those participants felt some pressure to put in a good effort simply because they were part of a research study, even if they wouldn't normally be that motivated by just a few Danish kroner. So that awareness of being observed could have led them to work harder than they would have otherwise.
So just the fact that it was an experiment could have skewed the results a bit. Okay, so taking all of that into account, the big question is, how much can we actually trust that the results of this incentive experiment apply to real-world situations? And I guess what I'm hearing is that it's not a simple yes or no answer. It depends.
Exactly. It depends on a lot of things. And that's why Bergenholtz 2025a stresses that external validity builds upon internal validity. If you're not confident that your study actually showed a cause and effect relationship, then worrying about whether those results will generalize is kind of pointless.
Right, you've got to get the foundation right first. Well, this has been a really fascinating deep dive into the world of RCTs. I feel like I've learned a lot. So to recap, these RCTs are really powerful tools for figuring out if one thing truly causes another. And that's mainly because of that random assignment and that control group, which helps us see what would have happened without the treatment. But like we've been talking about, it's not enough to just know if a study used an RCT. We have to think critically about how much those findings actually apply to other situations, and that involves looking at the participants, the setting, the timing, and even that Hawthorne effect.
Absolutely. And when you understand both the strengths and the limitations of RCTs, you can be a much more informed consumer of research. You can evaluate the evidence more effectively.
So it's about being savvy, right? Not just taking things at face value. This has been a really thought-provoking conversation. So as we wrap up, here's a question for you to ponder. Given all that we've discussed about RCTs, both good and bad, what kind of research questions do you think are best suited for this approach? And on the flip side, where might other research methods be more appropriate, especially in the fields that you're interested in? Food for thought, right?
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's always a pleasure to pick your brain.